Hello again, and welcome to the Grand Rapids Public Schools Wednesday weekly school informational session. And we want to just thank you once again for joining us to get some very brief information on how to keep our schools safe. We want to welcome some of our viewers that we've picked up from around the country. Tim Mallory in Virginia. We have Carl Barkis joining us out of New York. We have Manaz Jimenez joining us out of Toronto, Canada. And so welcome, and we hope that these tips that we provide for the Grand Rapids Public Schools can also help your schools as well. And Dwayne Wells down in Louisiana, we haven't forgot about you either. Again, welcome. My name's Larry Johnson, and I'm proud to serve as the Chief of Staff and the Executive Director of Public Safety for the Grand Rapids Public Schools. And this week, as we continue on in our series, Creating and Maintaining a Safe School Environment, Part 4, we want to take a look at emergency procedures. Emergency procedures. Emergency procedures and having a process on how to respond to a violent critical incident, or any incident for that matter in a school, is critically important. A crisis can occur on a campus at anywhere, anytime. The homicide, hostage situation, bomb threats, that's typical in our schools. But then there's the natural disasters or domestic assaults, trash can fires or fires in the neighborhood, gang-related activity or weekend events that end up on our campuses. Again, our schools is nothing more than a microcosm of the community, and whatever happens in the community will happen in our schools. But having a good response plan for that becomes critically important. So we want to look at just a couple things that we must do in the Grand Rapids Public Schools as it relates to emergency procedures. First of all, we want to talk about sheltering in place. Sheltering in place when that need is necessary. And what that is, it's just holding our kids, holding them safe. And we should always be operating our schools in a safe mode. But in the event that we need to stop movement, we want to make an announcement from a PA system that we will be sheltering in place. Staff will immediately lock their classroom windows and doors. Staff may continue to instruct unless directed otherwise. We want to follow the instructions given over your PA system, and do not allow anyone to leave the building until an all clear is given. If outside, you may have to remain outside unless instructions have been provided to you to enter the building. We do live in Michigan, and several times a year in the spring and the fall, we're concerned about severe weather. So our tornado procedures. And when you hear that tornado procedure and when it's directed over the PA system by our staff, we want you to turn off lights and close windows and doors. It's important to be accountable for students by taking the attendance. You want to walk to the designated tornado area, and you should know where that area is because our severe weather drills, you should have already planned to go to that location. Staff and students will get down on their knees, facing the appropriate wall and placing their hands. If outside and unable to get indoors, you need to seek shelter elsewhere. We want it to return to your room when the all clear is given. Remember, we want to stay out of rooms with high span roofs. Stay out of rooms with a lot of glass. Interior hallways is the best location for us when it relates to a tornado inside of in our community that may impact our school. Our fire procedures, and it doesn't matter, big, little, or small. Anytime there's a fire in a building, it must be evacuated. I want to stress that. Anytime there's a fire in a school building, that building must be evacuated. The alarm will sound. Take the class roster with you, close your classroom doors, and turn out the lights as students leave. Assemble at a designated location and immediate report any missing students. Again, we have grab bags in our rooms, in our nurse's office. If nurses have to be reminded to grab that grab bag with emergency supplies as you leave the building. Fire procedures and fire drills should be practiced at least 5 times a year, beginning upon the return of your students in the fall. Lockdowns. Now, we don't like to use codes and emergency management in schools, but in Grand Rapids Public Schools, we do use code red and code yellow. We don't use any secret codes. And we train to know that our code red is a full lockdown. And what separates a full lockdown from a code red from a code yellow is the fact that a code red is an unknown emergency inside or outside the buildings that has not yet been brought under control by school personnel. So when that announcement is made from the PA that we will be in a lockdown, staff will immediately lock doors and turn off lights. Students should be instructed to get on the floor in a sitting, crouching position away from windows and doors and remain silent. We do not call the office or make any phone calls, do not leave the classrooms or allow students to leave. We practice a red-green card process here in Grand Rapids Public Schools. Red card indicates that there's a problem in your room that needs to be addressed. Green card says that you have no problems, but that room is clear. We will address all the rooms as we enter. Now, one thing we want you to remember about lockdowns. You stay in a lockdown till you can be safely moved by the proper authorities. We are an options-based decision-making district. So we train our staff to make the best decision for that classroom, but they must be accountable for that decision. And if the exiting of that building is necessary, it must be done under the guidance of adults, trained adults, with law enforcement or school security personnel involved. Staff briefing and assessment will need to take place after a lockdown at the end of a day. Our code yellow. Again, we like to stay away from codes, but in Grand Rapids Public Schools, we do use code red, code yellow. Code yellow, again, it's a lockdown, a known incident that is under control that needs to stop our movement. Instruction may continue in a code yellow, but we will be turning off and limiting our two-way radios and our cell phones. We're going to remain in locked doors and admitting students to assigned classes. In a code yellow, you may admit students to an assigned class. In a code red, everything stops. If outside, remain outside and gather students. Be prepared to leave the area or come back into school depending on the instructions. A code yellow could be an issue in the community with a chemical release or anything outside that we do not have control of but does not impact the inside of the school. We want to limit our phone calls. We want to make sure that the calls that we're making are to emergency personnel. We want to plan for a faculty meeting at the end of the day. Evacuation to alternative sites when directed by a PA or the staff. Again, there may be a need after a lockdown to evacuate. We evacuate after we evaluate. We want to move closely to the appropriate area. Do not stop at lockers for coats and other personal property. Do not lock classroom doors. We want you to get out. When all staff has been accounted for, and when all students have been accounted for, we want to proceed to a designated predetermined evacuation site. Staff, remember to take your attendance books with you, although in this day and age, you can acquire that attendance through remote channels. But we want to take attendance so we can keep a record of every student and that who needs to be released to a proper parent. We want to check with our public safety security department and also law enforcement to verify site locations of where we need to evacuate. Every school has had at least 2 locations identified as an evacuation site and 1 site that has remained anonymous for a reunification site. We work with you in our drills and we work with our staff and all of our training to make sure you are aware of these locations. As you recall, early in some of our training, we talked about the 4 phases of emergency management, recovering being one of the most important, but a response also. And sometimes that response talks about the evacuation or a reunification site. Reunification site, lockdown to load up. Following an active violent incident in a school, reunification of students with parents begins. Students are loaded up and transported to a designated pickup site. Evacuation to then began. The building has been secured by law enforcement and teachers have verified attendance. Buses will be en route to and predetermined locations. They will pick students up and remove those students. Lockdown to load up. Students and staff should remain in a lockdown until released by law enforcement or school administrators. Barring unique circumstances, students should not be moved until they can be loaded and transported to a relocation site. Evacuation for relocation should be practiced as part of our lockdown drills. And when practicing lockdowns to load up, part of all of the student body should be removed from the lockdown to one of our pre-designated location sites. You've got to drill this. Drill it, drill it. Reunification is critically important. Reunification plans and sites. Every school building should have a plan or place for evacuation. These plans should be prepared well in advance and included in our alternative relocation sites. Planning may include writing agreements with public and private entities to assure the availability of the relocation sites. It is important to practice all school safety plans, including evacuation, lockdown to load up before you leave. Continuation, schools should have plans for alerting parents in the event of emergency. Plans should include a method for identifying and documenting those persons when they come to pick up their student. We must not release students unless those students are on a release form. Reunifications plan should notify parents picking up evacuated students to get to a location separate from the student location. Pre-trained staff should be present at both sites. The two location systems make for a more organized and quicker process. The process may be done at two separate buildings or at one facility if large enough to handle the volume and the need to separate our students. The Grand Rapids reunification process. The Grand Rapids Public Schools uses multiple reunification sites. The site must be large enough so that two staging areas can be formed, one of the parents and one for students. This includes separate entrances on a street that will allow for parent pickup and bus pickup. The district has two groups of staff to manage these sites. Parents must provide identification that matches with their student roster. Parents are issued bands or cards to pick up their students. Students are issued bands or cards that must match that parent who's picking up. The release individual must be on our emergency release or contact in order to be released to those individuals. The reunification takes place in an area that the parent and student, with a parent and student staging area. You know, all of these plans are outlined once again in our operations response plan. How we respond, how we recover will determine the next day, the next week, and the remainder of the year. At the conclusion of any evacuation, at the conclusion of any emergency procedure, filing of an incident report becomes very important. If public safety officers are assigned to a building, they will report the incident. If an officer is not assigned to the building or unavailable, contact your building administrator or contact public safety. Obtain a blank incident form from the district's info host, complete that form, keep a copy for yourself, give a copy to your building administrator, submit a copy to the Grand Rapids Public Schools Public Safety Department. Keeping staff and students safe is our job. So we put this book into the hands of principals, assistant principals, deans, secretaries, cabinet members, and other key administrators. We also make our operational response plans available to you online as well. You know, each week we have the opportunity to bring information to you. And we're just proud to be able to work with you and work with your families and work with your kids. The key is to keep all of us safe. Public safety and security should be at the top of the educational agenda. Security is everyone's business in the Grand Rapids Public Schools. Uniform security is the icing on the cake. But all of us, in order to maintain efforts at getting to the hardware of our students, not the hardware, but getting to the hardware, we must use all tools available to keep our students safe. I'm Larry Johnson, Chief of Staff and Executive Director of Public Safety for the Grand Rapids Public Schools. Thank you for joining us for part 4 of creating and maintaining a safe schools. We welcome your questions at securityquestions@grps.org. That's securityquestions@grps.org. And we look forward to joining you to part 5 and the final section of creating and maintaining a safe school. Thank you for joining us.